On this special pledge edition of Another View, a celebration of unsung civil rights heroes. Ever heard of Howard Thurman, Ellen Jo Baker, Evelyn Butts, or Fred Shuttlesworth? Scholars Dr. Kipton, Jensen, and Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander join us to share the unique stories of these selfless and brave people. But first, it's the last day of our fall radio pledge drive. And I hope as a listener and fan of Another View that you will pick up the phone and call 889-9476 to make your pledge of support. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee, and we'll be back to talk about civil rights pioneers you may not be familiar with right after we visit Pledge Central for an update on reaching our goal.
Discussing the issues and celebrating the successes of the African American community. This is Another View.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Another View on this last day of our Radio Fall fundraiser. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee, and if you haven't become a member of WHRV yet, today is the day to make that commitment. We'll visit Pledge Central throughout this broadcast to see how we're doing towards bringing our total down to zero. All those that applause you heard, that was to you all for supporting Another View. We really appreciate you. Now, Dr. Martin Luther King, Reverend Jesse Jackson, and Ambassador Andrew Young, Mrs. Rosa Parks, all giants in the civil rights movement and well known for their contributions. But what about all of the others who quietly yet forcefully played a key role in the fight for equality? Today we'll talk about a couple of them. Their names may not be as familiar, but their stories instill pride and demonstrate that it took the works of many from all walks of life to make a difference. Joining us for today's history lesson by telephone is Dr. Kipton Jensen, Assistant Professor of Philosophy with Morehouse College in Atlanta. Welcome, Dr. Jensen. How you doing?
I'm well.
Good. Thank you for joining us. And in our studio, our favorite historian, Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander from Norfolk State University. Dr. Alexander, how are you?
Just fine. How are you?
Good. Doing great. Dr. Kipton, Kipton, that is your first name, Dr. Jensen. We're going to start with you to talk about a gentleman by the name of Howard Thurman. Now, I was having a conversation recently with a friend of yours that you know well, who said to me, do you know who Howard Thurman is? And I said, I have no idea. And I started doing some research, which is how we kind of came up with the idea for this show, actually. You've become a scholar of Dr. Thurman.
I have. Yes, I've been thinking about Howard Thurman for about 10 years now, and I don't know if I consider myself an expert in Thurman yet, but there's a lovely quote from Thurman that he says, ask not what the world needs, but ask rather what makes you come alive. Go do that, because what the world needs is people who have come alive. In my experience reading Howard Thurman, who wrote over 20 books, is that I come alive reading him. And I think that was his experience on others.
That's fantastic. Okay, so tell us who he was and how he was instrumental in terms of civil rights.
Well, I think that you put it well. He was a quiet, though forceful reformer for many years prior to the civil rights movement, or you might say that he was part of the movement reaching back into the 20s. He graduated from Morehouse in 23, and he wrote a book in 1949 called Jesus and the Disinherited, which legend has it that Martin Luther King kept with him at all times, and that the Freedom Riders were clutching also during the Civil Rights Movement. King said that Thurman was one of the 12 most influential people of the 20th century, together with Gandhi and Einstein and others.
And he actually went to India and had a conversation with Gandhi, did he not?
He did. In fact, in 35 and into 36, Thurman was the leader of the first black delegation of friendship to India, Burma, and Sri Lanka, and he was the first to meet with Gandhi. And he is the one who encouraged Mordecai Johnson to meet with Gandhi, and then Mordecai Johnson is the person who encouraged King to meet with Gandhi also. So there's either a direct or indirect influence on King, certainly, through Morehouse, but later the Gandhi connection and Jesus and the Disinherited.
But and Thurman was told by Gandhi that African Americans would actually be the catalyst behind the nonviolent movement in this country.
Well, it's
do I have that right?
Yeah. Well, yes, I think so. And while he was in India speaking with Gandhi, Gandhi said that he was surprised that Thurman was a Christian because he thought that the Muslim religion was the only religion that was completely open and not segregated, and that Gandhi's view is that Christianity was actually being used to perpetuate segregation rather than knocking down the walls. And that was a real challenge for Thurman, who was a committed Christian and a pastor at that point, to understand how he was inspired by the religion of Jesus and yet acknowledge at the same time that organized Christianity in the United States at that time was not living up to its true calling. So one might say that following in the wake of his meeting with Gandhi and the challenge that Gandhi posed to him at that time, he developed Jesus and the Disinherited, which is his thesis on how Jesus was in a similar situation as African Americans were in segregated America, that he was a disinherited, he was an outcast, and that his love ethic was a mechanism for survival and a way of meeting hatred with love. And that's the Christian expression, he thinks, of nonviolent protest. So I think that seminal encounter with Gandhi in some ways set the direction for Thurman and eventually for the nonviolent character of the civil rights movement in the United States.
So now Thurman also was a pioneer in terms of being an African American first in a lot of his theological travel, was he not?
He was. He's such a unique personality, and he insisted on going his own way, to think freely and not to always represent blacks in America or Baptists or the African church, but that he wanted to be able to follow the instincts of his own mind and articulate those in a way that was uniquely his. So he insisted, I think, on going his own way, and that meant de facto that he was a first in many ways.
Mm-hmm. So he became, if I'm not mistaken, I think he taught at Boston College. He was at Howard University. Can you tell us a little bit about the different influences he had over university settings?
Yeah, no, that's great. He graduated from Morehouse, and he became a pastor in Oberlin College, Mount Zion Church. But at one point, his first wife had tuberculosis, and she was encouraged to come south. And so they came back to Atlanta. She went to LaGrange, Georgia, and he became professor of religion and philosophy here at Morehouse. And shortly after his first wife died, then he studied with Rufus Jones, who was a Quaker pacifist and the founder of the Fellowship of Reconciliation in the early 20th century. Mm-hmm. And then he went to Howard University, where he was professor of Christian theology and the dean of Rankin Chapel. And that's at that point that he developed his genius, I guess, for working with college students and exploring alternative methods of worship and meditation. And it was there that he got the call to start the first interracial, intercultural church in San Francisco called the Church search for the fellowship of all peoples. And it was there that he wrote Jesus and the Disinherited. In 1953, at the same time that Martin Luther King was at Boston University, Thurman went there and became the dean of Marsh Chapel. And he was there until 1965, at which point he retired and spent the rest of his life until 1981 as director of the Howard Thurman Educational Trust in San Francisco. So he was a first in many ways, I think.
How was his philosophy, the thought of this whole nonviolent protest prior to King making it so popular? How was he accepted?
Well, I think that he says in certain places that given the times, that his emphasis on nonviolence was sometimes viewed as cowardice, and that his insistence that this would be the way was like whistling in the dark. And so he felt, I think, challenged by those who were suggesting that violent means were better and necessary. And Carmichael, who suggested that why is it that blacks should be more ethical than whites. And so he addresses that challenge, I think, head on. And it comes from a very, I think, spiritual place, that he thought that no one ever wins a fight. He said that that's something that he learned from his grandmother, who had been a slave, Nancy Ambrose, early on. But that the more he reflected on it, he realized that violence and hate eventually poisons the soul, and even if one wins the fight, that at the end of it, one is depleted as a person. So he thought that under the circumstances and given the high ideals of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and given the tactics that were used by Gandhi, that nonviolence would work in the United States, and that we should insist on that not simply as a strategy, but also because after the movement or civil rights were achieved, that it was necessary that the souls of those who had carried it out are still full and able to love. So it's interesting that he wasn't just focused on nonviolence as a strategy that he thought would be effective, but that it was necessary to adopt a strategy that was going to enlarge rather than deplete the human soul. It's lovely, I think.
It is 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Join the conversation with us. Are you familiar with Howard Thurman and the contribution he made towards the civil rights movement ultimately? Do you have any questions for Dr. Jensen? 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Dr. Jensen, in doing my research, I want to share the story that I read when Thurman was raised in Daytona, Florida, and his schools only went to the 7th grade. So the family apparently scraped together some money to send him to high school in Jacksonville, Florida. And he had enough money to just buy his ticket. And when he got to the train station, they said, well, you have to pay extra to ship your trunk with all of his belongings. He said he sat on the train at the depot and just burst into tears because he had no more money. And a complete stranger walked by, an African-American man who was dressed in overalls. He paid the charges. He never introduced himself to Thurman. And when Thurman wrote his autobiography, he dedicated it to, quote, the stranger in the railroad station in Daytona Beach who restored my broken dream 65 years ago. What a powerful thing.
Amazing. Yeah, no, I love that. His autobiography is called With Head and Heart, and Thurman has a host of stories like that where his hope had ebbed, or his well was very empty, and then it was filled up by others who cared for him, and he seemed to have never forgotten about that. There's a lovely children's book about the life of Howard Thurman called Howard Thurman, Great Hope, in which he recalls that story. It's just beautifully illustrated, and the story's inspiring, but he's full of those
So why do you think his name isn't as prevalent in our minds as a Dr. King or as, some of the other people that I mentioned earlier on? What do you think why wasn't he as recognized from your perspective?
Right. Well, Barbara, it's a puzzle. I'm baffled myself, and I'm wondering why that is in some ways. Some of it, I suppose, is timing. And some of it is personality, that Thurman was very private and quiet and scholarly. He was a fabulous speaker. In fact, in 1952, Life magazine suggested he was one of the top 12 preachers in America. And so he had a following, and people did know him, but primarily as a speaker within the African American Church and the YMCA tour, but he seems to have always been behind the scenes and trying to develop the spiritual resources, the mechanism that would be in place for African Americans who were in the midst of the struggle. He was reticent to participate in many of the protests. He really had to force himself to walk in boycotts. But it's baffling to me with his involvement and how well known he was just 50, 60 years ago and 20 years prior to King, and influential on King's life at Boston University, in particular, that we know as little as we do within the African American community, but also a sense of our American heritage broadly construed about Howard Thurman. It's a puzzle to me also. I'm not sure why that is.
Before I let you go, what became your interest? Why have you decided to spend the last 10 years studying Thurman?
Well, I was interested in pacifism early on, as was Thurman. Thurman was interested in pacifism long before he met with Gandhi in 1936. He joined the Fellowship of Reconciliation in 1921, and he went to study with Rufus Jones, who was a Quaker pacifist prior to that as well. And so it was really my interest in pacifism and eventually in Rufus Jones that put me in connection historically with Howard Thurman. And when I read Jesus and the Disinherited, I was really bowled over by his insight and his thought on the anatomy of the emotions of the hounds of hell, as he calls them, of fear and deception and hatred, and the ways of overcoming that. And the more and more I read Thurman, the more baffled I was that we know so little about him. So my wife and I spent a number of years in Africa, 4 years in Botswana, and I was constantly reading Thurman. And when we decided to come back to the United States and to Atlanta in particular, I was lucky to get a job at Morehouse, from which he graduated, and there's a lovely Thurman obelisk on campus of Morehouse. And so everywhere I turn, there's encouragement to do more with Thurman. And there's also a personal sense that he has so much to offer, and we've not used him as a resource, not just for understanding the role that he played historically in the civil rights movement, but going forward into the 21st century. I think he's a rich resource, and we're depleted if we don't know more about him.
Well, Dr. Jensen, thanks to you, Hampton Roads knows more about Howard Thurman. Thank you so much for joining us. We really, really appreciate it. That's Dr. Kipton Jensen. He is an assistant professor of philosophy with Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. And Dr. Jensen, you have a lot of Morehouse graduates in this area, so I'm sure they've enjoyed listening to you today. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much to you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Cassandra, why some people who were able to really rise to the top and be way out there, and others who, like Thurman, that we rarely heard about, or some people I'm sure are just now hearing about?
I think there are two things going on. First of all, we as a society like to have icons, these figures who somehow summarize or represent a certain degree of change, not a dramatic change, not a radical change, but an incremental change, a change that somehow fits into the American dream, the idealistic change. Then you have others who may really be representative of a certain limited period of time, but do not necessarily complete the arc. That arc in time, and they're not the iconic figures that our society really grapples with and loves to grab a hold of. We also tend not to grab a hold of people who are behind the scenes, that they are the ones who get the work done. We tend to focus only on those who are out there in the forefront, who we see. They're the players on the stage.
But without the collective, it's very hard to get a movement going and to sustain it.
True.
Correct?
And also, I mean, our society has a tendency of trying to oversimplify a story. And so if you grab a hold of a single person, then there's an oversimplification. If you try to deal with a wider variety of people and the complexities of how something actually happened, then you pull in this audience, this crowd of people who were really instrumental in making this particular thing occur. And a good example are the people that you've mentioned at the beginning of your show.
Now, we're going to talk about another preacher, because Howard Thurman was more of a pacifist and more of a quiet preacher. I think that you probably wouldn't say that about Fred Shuttlesworth.
Not at all. And because of that, he was perhaps much more threatening in many ways. If you look at Fred Shuttlesworth, he perhaps did more than anyone else in helping to frame the civil rights movement, but a lot of people don't know about him because he made white society extremely uncomfortable. He didn't talk about reconciliation in the way that Martin Luther King talked about it. He wasn't to the point of burn, baby, burn, but he was
a lot further closer to that than he was to pacifism.
He was a confrontationalist. He believed that change only comes when you demand it and when you're willing to allow yourself to get beaten and killed for that change. Not that King wasn't willing to do that as well, but King was quieter in some ways than Fred Shuttlesworth. And he used to say that he was born in Birmingham, or he was born in Alabama, and perhaps because he had a hard head, God made him for Birmingham because they beat his head all the time and almost killed him a number of times.
Well, before we get into details about Fred Shuttlesworth, we've got to go over to Pledge Central and find out how we're doing in terms of our fundraising today. So hold that thought, and we will come back in just a little bit. Now, you all know that Another View is the newest program to join the WHRV family. And if you appreciate this show, please give us your support by calling 889-9476. Sandra and Dwight are over in Pledge Central. Let's go to them now to see how close we are to reaching our goal.
Okay. Thank you, Barbara. Fascinating show today on Another View, as always. 889-9476. We're just going to take a couple seconds here, a couple minutes rather, and hopefully convince you to make that pledge of support for programming like Another View here on WHRV. And you do that by dialing 889-9476, 889-9476. We're going to take you right back to the programming in just a few minutes here. Dwight Davis is with me. I'm Sandra Woodward. And we are counting it down this morning this afternoon. It is afternoon, yes. We're counting it down, trying to wrap up our pledge drive here today, and we're going to do it with your help. 889-9476.
Countdown underway, $73,110 and counting down. That number has slipped even while Barbara and friends were talking. That number has gone down, and you can make it go down even further. Thank you. I was standing here listening, Sandra, to the discussion here, and I thought, that's what this station is all about, intelligent discussion.
Yes.
Barbara said Another View is the most recent addition to the programming, but it continues the tradition of intelligent insight into issues of the day. Not just people jabbering, but intelligent conversation today about some unsung civil rights heroes. It's a wonderful program, Another View, heard each Friday here on WHRV, but with your support only. All of our programs are made possible with your support. As a matter of fact, most of the support for this radio station comes from individuals. That's statistically accurate. That is the right figure. Uncle Sam is withdrawing his funds. The state likewise is not helping out a whole lot. So you need to do your part to keep this sort of programming on the air. $73,110 counting down. All you need to do is pledge a few pennies a day at 889-9476.
And, they're talking, the discussion earlier about some folks who maybe aren't that noisy or a little bit quiet about what they do. And, public radio, especially here at WHRV, we tend to be quiet about this thing for most of the year. And a couple times a year, we have to get a little bit noisy about it. But, you travel up and down the dial, and I'm sure you probably have your listening right now. You change channels every once in a while to see what's out there. And I'll bet you usually come back. You're listening, aren't you? Because what else is out there is fairly noisy on a number of different levels.
Yes.
And what we do here tends to be very measured, very quiet. Now, I wouldn't want to say quiet, but certainly intelligent, as you said. And some might think of it as being kind of behind the scenes. And so a couple times a year we come to you and we get a little bit noisy. We get noisy about the fact that we need to keep this programming on the air. We remind you of why it is so important to have this on the air. And so this is why we talk to you for a couple of weeks. And we say, please call this number, 889-9476. Make that pledge of support. Invest in what you love. And if you love what you're listening to, and you must because you're listening right now here at 12:31 on a Friday afternoon. If you love it, invest in it. 889-9476. Let's get a little noisy in here, shall we?
Let's get noisy. As a matter of fact, your two otherwise pretty reserved morning hosts are going to get a little noisy. Sandra on WHRV in the morning. I'm on WHRV-FM. And we are here to talk to you, to have you call and pledge your support. And if we get a little over the edge, well, that's all right. We don't care.
We're a little punchy.
Yeah. 889-9476. Let us hear from you. Pledge your support for Another View, a fine program heard each Friday in this time slot, and a program that a lot of folks tune into. It is of interest to the African American community, but it also is of interest to everyone who wants to be informed and intelligent about the events of the day. 889-9476 or online, WHRO.org. A lot of folks getting to where I can't talk, Sandra. A lot of folks going online to WHRO.org. When you do, you'll be eligible to be entered into the drawing for the hot tub portable spa. You can read all about it online. Go at your convenience. You don't have to get dressed up. You don't have to talk to anybody. All you need to do is click around, and you'll be a member, and that number will drop down, 73-110. And we need to hear from you one way or the other right now.
And we've been hearing from lots and lots of renewing members today. Thank you all. We're going to be thanking some more of them here as we go through the afternoon. I just want to give a shout out in honor of the fact this is our brand new show here on WHRV. Let's get some brand new members on board, shall we? At 889-9476, 889-9476. Make that pledge of support. Come in at that starter level of $50. With 50 cents, you'll get another membership to give to someone else. See what it feels like to be a brand new member. Honor this great programming we bring you here on WHRV. Another View. If you love it, invest in it. 889-9476 is the number. 889-9476. Final hours of our fall membership drive. Let us hear from you. You can point, click, and pledge online at WHRV.org. And now we're going to take you back to what you're paying for. Another View.
And welcome back to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. If you're just joining us, we've been talking about unsung heroes of the civil rights movement. In our earlier half hour, Dr. Kipton Jensen from Morehouse College was with us, and he discussed a gentleman by the name of Howard Thurman. And we also have with us Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander from Norfolk State University. And Cassandra, before we move on to continue our conversation about Fred Shuttlesworth, Ruth is joining us from Virginia Beach. Hi, Ruth. You're on the air.
Hi, Barbara. This is Reverend Ruth Littlejohn. I'm a science mind minister, and I was so excited to hear talking about Howard Thurman. In the spiritual community, he's revered because his work was more of having us do what he called the inward journey, doing the inward work. And so he gets spoken a lot in New Thought communities about his work around the inward journey, doing the work on the inside before we do anything outside. So when I heard you mention him, I was so excited because I don't hear his name often. And one of the things we use a lot from Howard Thurman is he has a poem called High Resolve, Moments of High Resolve. And it just talks about the journey in such graphic, sensitive ways. So you're getting my excitement of finally hearing someone mention his name. So I appreciate that.
Well, thank you so much for calling, Ruth. We appreciate you too. Take care. So we're bringing out some new information to people, and others are saying, hey, finally, somebody's talking about someone that we're familiar with. Absolutely. So back to Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth. So give us a little bit of his history, Cassandra.
Well, he became pastor of the Bethel Baptist Church in Birmingham, and he was very much an advocate of the civil rights movement and of change. In fact, he joined with a number of people in 1957 to create the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. We know it as the SCLC. And most people, when they think of the SCLC, they only think of Martin Luther King Jr., but he was with that along with Ralph Abernathy and Ella Jo Baker, who was born right here in Norfolk, Virginia.
And I can't wait to talk about her because there is something in the water in Hampton Roads that causes people to really be very, very active in the civil rights movement. I was, not being from here, unaware. And Ella Jo Baker was one of those women who worked with SCLC and then went on to create SNCC.
Yes. Just to finish up a little bit about Shuttlesworth, he was the one who created the what he called Project C in Birmingham. The iconic images that you see of Bull Connor with the fire hoses and the dogs, and how Bull Connor really represented for the black community what they wanted the world to see, which was the sheer horror of what is the outworking of racism and prejudice, and how children, defenseless men and women, could be attacked simply because they wanted to be treated as full citizens in this country. And Shuttlesworth knew that Connor was that type of person, and that the Klan in not only Birmingham but in Alabama were working in concert with the police. And Alabama was one of the states, by the way, that banned the existence of the NAACP. A lot of people forget that.
And is that when the SCLC was founded to move because they were trying to get rid of the NAACP?
Yes, in part. But also they wanted another focus. The NAACP had a number of foci, but one of them, of course, was to eliminate segregation and discrimination through the law, especially throughout the country. They had other things that they did, but that was their primary focus. And of course, with the legal defense arm of the NAACP, they really started taking the lead by the 1920s and 30s. And by the 1950s, they were at the forefront. And so much of the effort and initiative of the NAACP went to support these kinds of legal cases. But the SCLC was a way, to get around some of these states that were banning the existence of the NAACP, but also as a way of pulling in the sacred community. So getting the ministers on board in an organization that was primarily headed by ministers and, more importantly, headed by men. And this is where you get into the beginnings of a division between the men and women who were part of this particular movement, because even the NAACP still was very much a male-oriented, I would say professional, meaning you had lawyers and you had doctors,
lawyers, and Indian chiefs.
and ministers. And they were really the ones who were in charge of that organization, and then also were in charge of the SCLC. And the women were the secretaries of the organization. They were the foot soldiers.
But they weren't the leaders. And you did have a few branches of the NAACP and the SCLC that were headed by women, but they were usually not really treated with the same kind of regard as those headed by men. I think I read that Shuttlesworth would call Bull Connors and say, "I'm going to be standing on this corner." I mean, he kind of invited
he taunted them.
So that because he knew that would also get national attention.
It's like waving a red flag in front of a bull. Bull Connor. and his whole initiative was called Project C, for confrontation. He wanted to provoke the confrontation because he knew that if he provoked him, he would do exactly what he wanted. Now, this kind of strategy was always associated with King, but it was actually Shuttleworth's strategy. It's just that once the press covered these things, they tended to only want to speak to one person or about a single individual.
There we go with that icon again, making something iconic. Reverend Shuttlesworth just recently passed in this month, as a matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken. October 5th?
Yes.
And I know we don't have a lot of time because we're doing Pledge today. We could talk about this all day, but I want to move on to Ella Jo Baker and Evelyn Butts, because these were both women from Norfolk who really made a significant difference. Now, Ella Jo Baker, as we said, she also helped to found SCLC, right?
And she was actually much older than Shuttlesworth. She was born in 1903. And her family originally came from North Carolina. Her mother came from Littleton, which is the same place as P.B. Young, and her father came from Warrenton County, which is that same area where Littleton was from. And they came here, and especially their father, to look for a job. He worked aboard ships, and so they were surrounded by people who came from North Carolina to Virginia looking for jobs in this growing industry that was booming in Norfolk around the turn of the 20th century. Her mother was a teacher, and so she came with a lot. But by the age of 7, they moved back to North Carolina, and in particular to Littleton, and she went to Shaw University. And she had a very, very different kind of upbringing because her mother was not only educated, but she was no wilting violet. and it seems that even at a young age, Ella Jo Baker here in Norfolk kind of parsed out her own world. She retells in her short autobiography a story about how this little white boy, and she couldn't have been more than 6 years old, basically called her the N-word and told her to get off the sidewalk, and she clocked him.
She started early.
She started very, very early. And she, like a lot of people who worked in the civil rights movement, was very, very private. In fact, in one of the autobiographies written about her, they said that no one really knew that she had been married. She was married for 20 years, but she never changed her name. So she never took on her husband's last name.
That was revolutionary.
Very much so.
Wow.
Very much so. In fact, when you look at a lot of these women who really made a difference in the civil rights movement, they were their own persons, and they tended not to follow the traditional paths set out about a woman's role. And when Baker helped to found, she was really the spearhead in founding the SNCC, which is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She made sure that it was very different from all the other organizations.
Different in what way?
She wanted young people of all classes there. The NAACP and the SCLC made sure that any students who were involved, that they wore very business-like attire, while SNCC was, the students were encouraged to wear blue jeans, what they called blue jeans at that time. They were encouraged to wear the clothing of the people, because she was offended that the privileged would have the audacity to speak on behalf of the underserved or the unprivileged people of society. And so she wanted that group to speak on their own behalf. And really, Evelyn Butts, who was also born here in Norfolk, represented that viewpoint. She was a woman who was orphaned by the age of 10. She was a seamstress. She struggled She and her husband struggled. They had a number of children, but she was not from the middle classes or the upper classes. And she became a spokesperson for those who were considered part of the underprivileged in society. And so Ella Jo Baker, in many ways, had a lot in common with Evelyn Butts. They were women who, when they walked in a room, they didn't have to say a word, but you knew that their presence was so large and was so formal that it was formidable for you to challenge them in some way.
Wow. Evelyn Butts, who I found out, I asked you, I said, I see this street sign named Evelyn Butts Boulevard, I believe it is, or street. And I was not familiar with her because I'm not from this area. But she actually fought to end the poll tax?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I have a quote from what Harry S. Byrd, who was the senator at the time, and of course he created the Byrd machine here in Virginia that still continues to impact the way we do business with the Dillon Rule. And we'll learn about that, I guess, in a year or two when they put tolls on all of our roads. But, he was opposed to ending the federal poll tax, the poll tax, and resisted when the 24th Amendment was passed that was supposed to eliminate all the poll taxes throughout the country. And Byrd said that he saw the anti-poll tax initiative as the first step to control state elections. He said that it would destroy the last vestige of states' rights and would give the New Deal, civilian employees, blacks, and labor unions control of the country. And so he saw this as a democratizing thing, and he resisted it. And it was Evelyn Butts working in conjunction with Joe Jordan, who was the first African-American elected in the 20th century to city council, and he later became a judge. And he was a bulldog when it came to standing up for the rights of African Americans. Well, she worked in conjunction with Joe Jordan to eliminate the poll tax and allowed herself to be used in this test case in 1963 called Butts versus Harrison, that would later be cobbled together with several other lawsuits. And eventually it was the Harper versus the Virginia Board of Elections, and that would eventually eliminate the poll tax by 1966.
You know what, Cassandra? I think we've started a new series. Seriously, I would love to hear from our listeners about if they would send us some ideas of people that they are familiar with or that they have questions from throughout history that were not as well known, like the people we talked about today, because I think it's really, really important for us to know our history. We have to know from whence we've come before we know where we're going.
Absolutely.
And so would you be willing to do that with us? That would be awesome. That would be great. Evelyn Butts, Ella Jo Baker, Fred Shuttlesworth, Howard Thurman. Just critical people who were instrumental in making sure that all of us have equality today, even though we're still working on the issue.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate the fact that you were here with us. And we'll be right back in just a few minutes.
So people get ready for the train to Jordan, picking up passengers coast to coast. Faith is the key, open the doors and board them. There's hope for all among those loved the most. People get ready, there's a train a-coming. You don't need no baggage, you just get on board. All you need is faith to hear the Jesus humming.
And welcome back. And I'm very serious about that, listeners. If there is a person that you know about or you have questions about from history, particularly the history of the civil rights or any other issues that face African Americans, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us at another radio anotherviewradio.org, and send us your ideas, or you could call us here at the station, 889-9400, and Lisa and I would be happy to hear from you. So now, if you're a fan of television talk shows or news magazine programs, you've probably watched Dr. Ian Smith dole out advice or offer his medical opinion on various topics. Perhaps you've read an article about him in People, Cosmo, or Ebony magazine, or maybe you own a copy of his New York Times bestseller, The Fat Smash Diet. Ooh, say that 3 times. Our Lisa Godley recently sat down with this doctor, author, and Harvard graduate. He's on a mission to change the way we eat and the way we think in hopes of improving our overall health.
To guide the celebs on their journey is Diet Dr. Ian Smith.
It's always an excuse. Push through the excuses.
For years, medical and diet expert Dr. Ian Smith has challenged us to take better care of ourselves. Not only did Dr. Smith create the 50 million pound challenge, but he's the voice of wisdom on VH1's popular program, Celebrity Fit Club. So In Another View had an opportunity to sit down with him and solicit his much sought-after advice. That's just what we did.
First, let's talk about why African Americans seem to get a pneumonia when everyone else seems to get a cold. African Americans, historically speaking, tend to access the healthcare system when the disease is at a more advanced stage and therefore less curable, and therefore the consequences are more drastic. Secondly, African Americans tend to have less access to good care. And thirdly, when you look from a cultural standpoint, our behaviors, there's been a huge distrust in the African American community towards the medical establishment, not trusting it, not believing it, not complying to instructions from physicians.
Dr. Smith says what he tries to do is explain to African Americans that they need to be something he calls health literate.
African Americans need to understand the basics of healthcare, not, how I understand it as a physician. But you need to understand, how the body works at a basic level. You need to understand what prevention strategies are, what kind of screening tests that you need. These are basic issues that every African American should understand and should implement in their prevention strategy for being healthier.
He's the author of 4 books, including the New York Times bestseller, The Fat Smash Diet. And he's about to release his 5th. But unlike the others, which focus on diet and offer medical advice, this new book tackles something new: relationships.
I was at an Essence panel about a year and a half ago, and the panel was supposed to be about how to help African American get their health groove back. The panel deteriorated into how do you find a good man and keep a good man and all these kind of things. I was like, what happened to our health panel? Well, it was all about now, how do you get a man and how do you keep a man? And so I'm sitting on this panel with all these very prominent women, and what they were telling the audience to me made no sense. I made up my mind that I was tired of this stuff, and I was going to write the book from a man's perspective to help women understand why men do what we do. And men like football, sports, they like cars, we like watches. This is who we are. We want our time alone sometimes. So kind of touching some sensitive issues that we don't discuss with you because we're afraid or awkward to tell you about these particular issues.
But the issues that have made Dr. Smith so well known around the country are health related. So I asked him to leave the Another View listeners with 3 things that we should do to improve our overall health.
The first thing is physical activity. African Americans are way, way, way in the deficit when it comes to physical exertion. We don't walk enough, we don't exercise enough, we don't play enough from a physical standpoint. Secondly, the way we eat. The way we eat is abominable. We don't eat enough fruits and vegetables. And this isn't just my opinion, it's also well documented in studies. We consume too many empty calories. Things like pastries and donuts, fried foods, which are just nothing but calories with very little health benefit. But thirdly, African Americans need to learn how to reduce their stress, whether it's meditating, doing yoga, dancing, doing something that will help us ease the burden of our day-to-day stress.
The bottom line, take care of your body, and it will in turn take care of you. For Another View, I'm Lisa Godley.
And there's a perfect way to release your stress. Just go to your phone and dial 889-9476 and support WHRV and Another View. Today is the last day of our Radio Pledge Drive. So we're going to say goodbye a bit early so we can go back to Pledge Central and see how we're doing towards reaching our goal. For producer Lisa Godley, audio engineer Perry Smith, our interns Curtis Jennings and Aisha Hawk, I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Have a great weekend, and please call 889-9476 to support Another View and WHRV, and let the volunteer know that that's what you're doing. We'll see you next Friday for Another View.
Cassandra Woodward with me, Dwight Davis, and we are in the final hours of our fall membership drive here on WHRV. 889-9476, the number. 889-9476. You can also point, click, and pledge online. A lot of folks doing that's the popular thing to do today, it seems like, at WHRV.org. However you do it, we hope to hear from you today in the final hours of our fall membership drive. We are counting it down this afternoon, counting down to zero from this number, $70,947.
Great.
Quite a change, I would say,
yes,
Dwight, from when we came in this morning when it was like over 100,000.
Yes,
so
it was.
the folks are making the calls. We need you to make some more, though. If you have been waiting for the last minute, the last minutes are upon us. So all of you with the hero syndrome, as Todd Rosenleib was calling it this morning, if you want to be the hero, this is the time to do it. 889-9476, 889-9476.
Call us and pledge your support at whatever level. It really doesn't matter. And if you tune in for just a few of the fine programs on this station, your contribution will help and go a long way.
And it will. Right there.
There is no minimal amount. I was thinking a little while ago, Sandra, that people should not say, well, I apologize, I didn't call in, or I've been listening for a long time and I haven't called in yet. Don't do that. Don't feel bad. Just do it. Just call in, right. 889-9476, and say, yes, here's my vote for this programming, such as Another View. As a matter of fact, Sandra and I are in the studio with the volunteers here, and Barbara's in another studio, but I hope Barbara's listening, because Barbara, we had a call from Henry Howell's son. Henry Howell, for those who have been in this area for a while, was one of the great mavericks in politics here in Hampton Roads and in Virginia. And it was he who represented Evelyn Butts in the fight against the poll tax many, many years ago, as discussed on Another View. So, Hank, good to hear from you. Thank you very much for your pledge of support. Mike and Ann Dubik of Norfolk, we thank you for your pledge to WHRV and all the fine programming. 889-9476. Do give us a call. Help us get that number below 70,000. We're at 70,947 and dropping fast.
And 889-9476 is how you can make that happen. Every single phone call counts. As Dwight said, any amount certainly counts. It could be a few pennies a day. It could be a few dollars a day. Every single bit of this goes to the programming you love. Another View, one of those great programs we bring you here on WHRV. All of this made possible by you, the listener, and not just the listener, but also, of course, a supporter. And I've been putting the challenge out to new members. So far, have yet to see one come across my my table.
Yeah, no, everybody's
been renewals. We love you guys because you know how it works. So what I'm talking to now, the folks who aren't exactly sure why we're doing this, we do it because the funding that we ask for, we come to you and we ask for a certain amount of funding that we know we need to keep this station going. 889-9476. We need to finish this drive up right now. We need $70,000.
$70,000. That can be done. I'll tell you what, Sandra. Let's pinpoint some people. Let's call out some names, not people, but places.
All right.
That now are in the WHRV
so we know you're
broadcast
listening.
area. So those of you in Diggs, up in Gloucester, in Deltaville, or maybe Cobbs Creek, or in Hayes, or Mattaponi, let's see, Oak Hall up on the Eastern Shore. You're probably getting us loud and clear now. Bellhaven, also on the Eastern Shore. Bird's Nest, what a great name, on the Eastern Shore. We go as far as Wallops Island, I think, with the WHRV increased signal on the Eastern Shore.
There's a call right there.
All of you folks in those areas who have not pledged before, this is what we're all about, asking for your support a couple of times a year, and we need to hear from you right now at toll-free, 800-940-7170 if you're outside the immediate area. 800-940-7170 or main number 889-9476. When we come back to you, that number guaranteed below 70,000 thanks to your support.
889-9476 the number. And let's just be clear, the reason you're hearing us up there on the Eastern Shore, Northern Neck, is because we spent